Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this African Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. It is a great honor for me to be here with all of you. Today, I hope we can have a meaningful discussion and a meaningful dialogue around Indigenous knowledge systems and practices on disaster risk management. I would like to warmly welcome all of you to this event. And let me introduce myself. My name is Yolanda Lopez. I work at the Local and Indigenous Knowledge System Program at UNESCO. And this is an important event for me, being myself an Indigenous member of a community in Mexico, bringing all of you here to present your ideas and the challenges we as Indigenous communities we face every day for maintaining and preserving our knowledge. It's important also for me to remember that this workshop is organized jointly by UNESCO and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, but also with the support of the African Union on Indigenous and Local Knowledge in Disaster Risk Reduction. The overall goal of this event is to collect examples and to examine the potentiality in how our Indigenous and local knowledge can help disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. We will have three panelists that will present their projects and their examples, but also two additional comments by members of Indigenous communities and also other associations. I would like to deeply thank you, all of you, and the organizations that have joined today and that made possible to carry out and to have this event today. So we hope we can generate many important discussions around this topic. Especially, I would like to thank the Indigenous communities and organizations that are with us today. So I would like to invite Mr. Kai Gatquote. Mr. Kai is the Technical Coordinator Disaster Risk Reduction of the African Union. So he will give us a brief comments for the opening of this event. Mr. Kai, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Yolanda. So I'm glad to join this session. This is also particularly interesting to us here at the African Union to have the voices of Indigenous people at the center of the Africa Regional Platform for the first time. Over the years, the idea of including Indigenous knowledge for decision-making has come up several times, but we were wondering how this could be really moved forward. And one thing we always emphasize is that we need to know really what Indigenous practices are there, what kind of Indigenous practices and knowledge on disaster risk management and climate change in particular that are relevant in contemporary society. And we need to look at the relevance of those knowledge and see how best they can be included in policy discourses. But this has not been forthcoming. And I hope this session will elevate this discussion and for us to be able to hear some practical knowledge systems that can be validated and that can be used as a tool for advocacy to move this agenda forward. From our side at AU Commission, we are committed to move this agenda forward because we believe when the Indigenous knowledge system is recognized, it means that people and communities will partake in policy decision and policy implementation. And in that way, we'll be able to bridge gap between communities and policies. Because at the moment, we need to ensure that we are at the same level of knowledge. We are not sure whether the policies, the global policies and framework, as well as continental policies, are at the same level of implementation and at community level. So bringing community knowledge and practices on board for us is key to ensure that there is this dialogue, the discourses between us, between communities, the science and the communities, is narrowed because currently there are gaps that are existing. And we are really very happy that we have this first session. This is the first kind of session in many years. And I hope with this we'll be able to move forward to concrete discussion on existing indigenous knowledge systems on the continent. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your words, Mr. Kai. It is a great honor to have you here in this session. I would like just to mention that this event is being recorded, and you can all the time ask questions using the chat, and we will try to answer all the questions at the end of the panelists' presentations, but also we will give some space for questions and answers after each of the presentation. We appreciate our distinguished panelists and participants turning off their microphones if they are not speaking, and also to make sure that if you, in case of any questions or concern about technical issues, please ask us in the chat. So let's start with our panelists and the panel discussion. Today, I would like to introduce Ms. Nailajileji Dipap. She is a member of the Gender and Public Relations Coordinator, Pastoralist Indigenous NGOs Forum, and she will be giving us a presentation about the application of indigenous and local knowledge in climate risk management among pastoralist women in Eastern Africa. So, Ms. Nailajileji, could you please join us and share your screen?
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be part of this discussion and the dialogue that today we are conducting here. My name is Nailajileji Dipap. I work with Pastoralist Indigenous NGO Forum, which is basically in Tanzania. We work with communities of indigenous from Tanzania, who are the Badbaik, the Maasai, the Hadzabe, and the Akie communities, who are located in different parts of Tanzania. I've been working here for the past 4 years now, and being one of the indigenous women from the pastoralist community in Ngorongoro district, I'm very glad to be part of working with them. Based on my presentation, I'll just pass through different issues that we've been working with, especially on issues of climate change and weather focus based on women in pastoralist communities, and how this has been one of their ways in adapting the situation of climate change through what is going on currently in the world. First of all, indigenous women are among the marginalized group within the communities that they live in. If you go to the communities of pastoralists, still they're among them groups that have low voices. They can't air their issues due to the tradition and custom that are built in these communities. We really recognize this tradition and custom to be they are those who are very good, very remarkable, that even other communities feel like even adapting them, but there are few of them that still discriminate and violate these groups in the communities. Based on my presentation, we try to put out on how these indigenous women also have the indigenous knowledge based on weather focus and climate change. Based on that, in regards to Tanzania, I'll try to overview in a way that I can trace how do the indigenous women themselves focus the issues of climate change and the weather focus. I'll start first with the signs that make the women or the indigenous women identify the situations or the weather forecast through the fauna and flora that is around them. First of all, Indigenous women identify the weather forecast through trees, insects, birds, animals, and even the environment itself. There are many trees that are in vernacular language. Most of them, we don't know their scientific name, that clearly show the time now, the situation they are going into, how the climate is going to change, and their preparedness to the situation they're getting in. In pastoral communities, the indigenous pastoralist communities, we have about 4 main seasons. One, the 2 main seasons are the dry season and the wet season. But in between, we have short rains. We have after the dry season, we have short rain, and then the rain itself, which is now taking a wet season. And then we have the rain season, which is more prolonged, and we have the end, the one that prepared to the dry season. But the main 2 seasons that we know are the dry season and the wet season, which is the raining season. But all these are identified through the flora and fauna, where they look at the trees, making them to know now, currently, we are going to a certain season. For example, we have a tree called Oribali. It's a local tree in which it tends to shrink in the 10th month. In the 10th month is the short rain month, where now they know we are heading to a raining season. But there is also a tree in a vernacular language called Orpupande. It's the end of the 9th month, where it sheds trees. When it sheds trees, it indicates that we are going close to the raining season. So we say now the trees itself give them to know the weather forecast and the situation they are going into. But if you come to the insect, those are just a few examples. If you go to the insect, we realize that there is some insect, if they become many or they come into the house, these are like the bats that occur in the 6 months, where it marks the end of the rainy season. Now they understand now it's the end of the rainy season. So the time we are getting into, we have to prepare ourselves for the dry season. But we have also the birds. There are birds like the ostrich. These birds also, when they have a certain sound, that when they produce that sound, clearly the women will realize that, oh, now we are heading to the rain is closer to us now. We prepare ourselves for the main rain season. And this rain season will take a long time or will take a short time, according to the cry of the sound that made by the ostrich or the other birds like Olmundu, which I don't know the scientific name or the English name, that's a vernacular language, also clearly show the situation. But we have animals like the cows that they rear themselves. Most of the time, when milking, pastoral women understand when she's milking a cow, she'll know that if this cow is having a lot of milk, either she will know that, oh, this is a productive year. But if the milking and then the little milk comes, she knows that this year automatically it's going to have a prolonged drought. That's no science. That's how their own science. So we can see that there are ways they realize. But also sometimes when the cattle come out of the boma and look a certain direction and their nose uplifted up, that clearly shows them that we are close to the raining season. So there are different ways, even the leaves, even the environment itself, that shows the weather forecast to them. In these 4 seasons, that those two main seasons, women have their own activity that they have at every season. That how do they prepare themselves to the rainy season? How do they prepare themselves to the drought season? First, to make clear is that we realize that the communities of pastoralists, especially in Tanzania, most of them reside in semi and arid areas. So automatically, we understand the climate that surrounds. So during the preparedness to the both season, women have their own activities that they do. For example, in the raining season, which is Olari, which is the raining season, women will have their own activity, which include cleaning of livestock sheds and barns, which is their main task. They'll be doing at this time, and they will be plastering their house, especially during the rain season. We know how they live, their houses, how do they look. Milking will be in hive, and in this milking, they'll be preparing. They'll be storing I don't know what it's called in English, but it's samli. I don't know its English. It's like a cheese that is being stored to be used in the dry season. So that's their time of the milk and have different containers. They have their traditional calabash and they'll be storing, making it, preparing it for the dry season. Also during this season, there will be also, due to the current situation of climate change, they have opted to other activities. And in other areas, they have opted even buying the foreign food, like buying food from the farmers, storing it to be able to be used during the dry season, where the dry season depends on a year, which will be long or short. When it comes to the dry season, women will be searching for water, either for domestic use, for the sick animals, and also for the also for even plastering their houses. Most of the time, as I said previously, this community live in arid and semi-arid areas. So water is being searched from long places. They have to trek long distance in search of water. But also they'll be feeding the sick animals. So they'll be having that work to be done. But also during this season, they prepare themselves for the wet season, which is the raining season. So they will be storing, they'll be collecting a lot of firewood, building materials for their houses, sometimes even looking at farmers in order to book their lands during the dry season to use them for their cattle, to rear their chickens there. So this is the time also they'll be doing that. But also buying crops from the farmers. This also, most of the market currently, if you go, women are there. They're the one buying this food for their
Mrs. Tipap.
Okay.
Mrs. Tipap, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So what about if we stop here your presentation, because we want to give enough time to hear the other presentation, and then we come back with you with more questions in case you want to share more information with us. Is that okay for you?
I'm ending.
Yes.
I'm at the end now. I was just sharing in short on how this IK is being used in indigenous community, especially in women. But I wanted to show the ecosystem that we share also with the other wild animals. If you see this picture, you can see the ecosystem. This shows the love that we have with the environment. But because of the time, let me conclude with this. I would like to conclude it with a few recommendations that, based on these communities that we live in, we are facing a number of misunderstanding and even notion on indigenous people, especially in countries like Tanzania. We are still not recognized communities of indigenous. Indigenous communities have best practices we have land use plan, which is traditional land use plan that enable us to sustain the two seasons that I already just clearly said before. Based on that, we call upon everyone to love and learn the livelihood of the pastoralist community and indigenous community, and also have frequent research and understanding the IK that the community of indigenous do have. I just concluded here.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your important presentation. I think we will have after the next panelist, we will have a round of questions and answers, so we can all engage in this discussion. So I would like to give the floor now to my colleague, Mr. Joseph Karanja. Joseph, would you mind to start your presentation?
Thank you so much, Yolanda, for giving me the floor. My name is Joseph Karanja. I work with Yolanda here at Local and Indigenous Knowledge System, and particularly I'm spearheading one of the project on Indigenous and local knowledge to support the BaseNet initiative that I'll be talking about. As you're aware that there is increased recognition on the importance and the contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities and their knowledge in addressing different global challenges, including disaster risk reduction, climate change, as well as biodiversity loss. In this presentation, because I know most of you already know some of this knowledge on how it is actually contributed to disaster risk reduction. So on this presentation, I'll dwell more on how can we connect indigenous and local knowledge with the science and other knowledge systems so that we can enhance disaster risk reduction initiative through programs and policy as well. And for us to understand this, I think it is important for us to contextualize the vulnerability of indigenous peoples and local communities, so that when we understand, when we talk about vulnerability to disasters, we know actually indigenous and local communities might be more vulnerable or might have a contextualized vulnerability as we know in terms of disaster risk reduction. First, as you're aware, indigenous peoples and local communities, their livelihoods, cultures, and lifestyle is very dependent on the nature because of their deep connection with the nature. Therefore, they're very vulnerable, especially they're very vulnerable when these ecosystems or nature is degraded, either through disasters or climate change or other threats associated, for example, with land use, the land use change. Therefore, loss of ecosystem to indigenous communities, to them, this is not just a loss to their livelihood, but is also threatening their existence, their culture, their identities, and knowledge. So to this extent, when we are approaching or developing intervention, to address or to increase the resilience of the resilience of indigenous and local communities that are actually connected to their ecosystem, we should understand that this is not just a resilience approach per se, but this is an approach that is embedded within the human justice system. And therefore, it's important that we also include the aspect of human-based rights approach in this initiative. And therefore, disaster risk reduction should therefore be centered and driven by the indigenous and local communities. And because of the increasing recognition of these, different instruments at particularly at the international level, and here I would like to dwell more on the IP-based assessment that have been working with indigenous and local knowledge and including this knowledge to the global assessment, has actually paved the way for the mobilization and working with indigenous local knowledge into the policy formulation. And one of the key issue on this is because indigenous peoples and local communities are one of the most eco-illiterate and adaptive human beings. Most of them may not be able to know how to read or write, but they may have deep knowledge about ecosystem that is that is even less studied by by science, and this knowledge can stretch back to centuries. So the main idea is how to how to address this knowledge, to mobilize this knowledge. The good thing is that already at the global level, we are developing different platforms that are setting the stage for the mobilization of this knowledge. And SEDI framework has been one of the key instruments in raising the awareness and reaffirming and recognizing the importance of working with indigenous and local knowledge in DRR issues. And this starts from the preamble when, for example, they call for people-centered approach, and they also call for the inclusion of critical stakeholders, including indigenous peoples. Also in the guiding principle, for example, guiding principle 19G, calls for inclusive, informed decision making that is based on open exchange and dissemination of disaggregated data that are complemented by traditional knowledge. And this also has been highlighted also in the priority of action, where they are calling inclusion of indigenous knowledge to complement scientific knowledge. And also the Paris Agreement have also reaffirmed that the adaptation, for us to have effective adaptation strategies, we must look into how we have to look on how indigenous knowledge can also complement on the science. But the main issue is we are saying that indigenous knowledge can complement science, but how can we make this happen? And what are the challenges? What are the opportunities in doing so? And I'm going to share this, based on one of the projects that we are doing. And the idea, when you're bringing the indigenous and local knowledge together, the goal is to provide the best available knowledge to drive innovative and inclusive disaster risk reduction policies and into programs. And I'm going to contextualize this on how we are doing in one of the projects that I'm working on, which is called the BaseNet project. BaseNet in food is Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Network. This is a project managed by a consortium of partners led by UNDP, UNEP WCMC, and UNESCO. Here at UNESCO, we host the BaseNet Indigenous and Local Knowledge Support Unit, which started last year. And specifically, we are supporting countries to work with indigenous and local knowledge in the national ecosystem assessment. And this assessment is mainly led by the UNEP WCMC. And one of the key platforms that we use is what we call the BaseNet trialogues, which are led by the UNDP, where we create a dialogue opportunities between knowledge systems. When I talk about between knowledge system, I mean science and also indigenous and local knowledge, but also you also bringing policymakers and practitioners together so that we can holistically be able to address issues to do with biodiversity and ecosystem issues. And this kind of approach can also be applicable in DRR issues. So at the BaseNet initiative, we are promoting multiple evidence approach. In the multiple evidence approach, we are promoting working with different knowledge systems, not only working with science, but also working with knowledge, with indigenous and local knowledge, and try to synthesize this knowledge together so that you can have more informed, more holistic, and more inclusive policies, and this also can be adapted to the disaster risk reduction issues. One way to do this is first by recognizing that indigenous and local knowledge is a legitimate source of knowledge in itself. And we should try to avoid the temptation of trying to, because it's a legitimate source of knowledge, we should not try to use science to legitimize indigenous and local knowledge. And through what we have run through this process is that these two knowledge systems are complementary in nature, and therefore, when working with these two knowledge systems, is important that we have mutual respect for each knowledge, because each knowledge is produced and practiced at a different platform. So the first process is understanding this platform. And therefore, in terms of validating indigenous and local knowledge, it's important that we validate indigenous and local knowledge using indigenous systems that have been empirically and tested over time. And there's several methods that we can share with you. We can share with you some of the methods that we have been promoting, working with the country partners to mobilize indigenous local knowledge, although these are in the context of ecosystem assessment, but some of them can be applied in disaster risk reduction. In conclusion, however, when you're working with different knowledge systems, of course, there are going to be some issues that are agreeing what you are calling convergence. So what we are promoting, for example, within the assessment, ecosystem assessment, is that when you try to connect this knowledge together, the idea is not to integrate indigenous local knowledge into the science, but to give each knowledge a space to communicate for itself. So when they are agreeing in each other, so you can put them in parallel, and where there's the disagreement or contradiction, it doesn't necessarily mean that indigenous and local knowledge is wrong and science is right. So it's good that we acknowledge these differences so that we can have more informed policy and projects. So I'll leave it there at the moment, but happy to address and also to hear participants' views on the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. This is really interesting, and it goes along with all the topics that we are dealing today about how to better make use and to preserve indigenous and local knowledge. I really appreciate your presentation as well. So maybe we can have more discussion about that after or during our question and answer session. So I'm not sure if Mr. Gakemoto Satao is here or is able to share with us some of their comments and experiences on indigenous and local knowledge. But in case no, we can continue with the program, and I would like to invite Dr. Tavi Joda, which is the Executive Director of the Green Aid and Coordinator of Indigenous Network. Dr. Joda, are you here with us today? Are you able to give us a couple of insights about this topic we are dealing today?
Yeah, thank you very much, Yolanda.
Thank you.
And thanks to all the participants and panelists, as well as thank you very much. Just to note that this session is being done also in collaboration with us, Green Aid. As we are currently hosting the new alliance, Africa Alliance on Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices in Climate Change Adaptation and DRR, which I expect that perhaps after this, we should have that convergence which just have talked about. So I want to highlight very much on perhaps not to repeat what the earlier speakers have said, that indigenous knowledge cannot be overemphasized, especially its importance and the role which this ancestral wisdom play in terms of determining how we preserve our ecosystem and how we combinedly put the ethos, the various folkways, practices, and customary ways which are supporting our local communities for several centuries today. I come from an indigenous community and I have lived that life and still living that life. Perhaps that's why I am promoting this as also a way of life for governments to adopt, and of course the entire global system to understand that that's the way to go. However, we have seen very well from the earlier presentations the adaptive relevance of indigenous knowledge practices and systems, how strong they are in preserving ecosystems and conserving our environment and preserving biodiversity, and of course, pushing forward resilience at local levels. And this is very important for us to note that it is not only in terms of adaptation. We have seen early warning from the presentation made by our friend in Tanzania. We've seen that also early warning mechanisms exist very strongly in indigenous systems practices, which we need to bring into existence. Now, not to repeat, let me go very straight into looking at the challenges that are existing right now. We come from a point where people see indigenous knowledge as an unimportant part of knowledge, or as an unimportant knowledge system. It's archaic, is uncivilized, it is poor, it is made for poor people. We forget very well that every food that we eat, wherever we are in our big cities, comes from different local communities. You know, the milk that is consumed, the cheese, the various spices that people eat, people tend to forget that it is some knowledge that has been existing over the centuries that is embedded in the way and manner in which these foods are produced, the way these tree crops, the nuts, the oils are produced, and how they are conserved and how they get onto our table. So you see the role of indigenous knowledge in food systems and how they preserve the vital aspect of food system that constitutes what is relevant for healthy humans who live by healthy food and nutritional, a condition. That's one. Two, we've seen very recently how indigenous products have been replaced by modern products. Unfortunately, the modern products are actually hazardous to our environment. Take, for instance, the bowls made from wood, from calabash, from the barks of trees and the leaves that we used before in packaging our food are now replaced with plastics. And what is the consequences? We see the seas are littered with plastics, the lands, the farms are littered with plastic materials. We see our immediate gutters in communities are littered with plastics, and these plastics have hazardous effects on human beings, on aquatic life, on agricultural lands, destroying our own very ecosystem on which our lives depend upon. So the question now is there wisdom in this indigenous system where these materials that were all nature-based were conserving, and they were all renewable, that were conserving and preserving the very ecosystem that we depend on, or this modern practice, what so-called, quote unquote, modern practice, where plastic materials, where metal materials are littering and actually polluting our environment? That is a very huge question, which is tied to a challenge that we face. We can't accept that a system that is faulty gets more vetting, more validation for. Look at our conferences. In our conference halls, we see plastics everywhere. Everywhere. We are all guilty of this. So the challenge here is we shouldn't be blind by that notion that indigenous knowledge or indigenous materials or indigenous science is archaic, is uncivilized, it is poor, because we feel that fancy things that destroy our environment should be promoted than these things rather. So again, one other challenge that we are facing currently that is affecting indigenous knowledge from getting really into the limelight and playing its own critical role. Let me just give, for example, peer-reviewed articles. In the intellectual world, we produce medicines from herbs, from plants, plant-based medicines. They don't get validated. People write articles from local communities, from the communities in the articles about indigenous knowledge. But these articles need to go through a peer-reviewed mechanism, or they need to be peer-reviewed for them to be validated, to be called articles that are published. Do we see a challenge? Whereas we have failed to understand that right in our own four-ways, customary practices, and indigenous knowledge systems and traditions, there are these bulk of knowledge, wisdom, and traditional systems that have existed over these centuries that have actually helped society to communicate, help society to preserve knowledge, help our societies to actually capture the way people live in a more enhanced, risk-sensitive manner. I will just put this, for example. Why is it that during this COVID period, we've had more casualties of death in our urban cities than in the rural communities, where during the so-called stay-home period, we have our women, we have our mothers, our fathers were going to take care of their cattle. Some were taking care of their farms, going to the local markets. People were mingling and interacting, and eating together, as you know, in a communal way, which is a very strong indigenous practice that we have held for centuries. But we didn't see coronavirus actually killing or actually affecting us. So the question now is, who was more resilient to coronavirus, to this virus that, of course, it is the people in the city, or these are the people that were more vulnerable. We at the local communities, we had more resilience. So the question is now, what knowledge did we use? Have you found that if our knowledge was archaic, poor, brutish, and uncivilized, can it actually help us to build a resilience to a global pandemic that has taken so many lives than ever thought by science? That is a question that we have to also look and debate about. And of course, I am using this to say the indigenous knowledge systems practices are very strong, not only for adaptation, they are strong for building the kind of societal, social coherence that communities live with, that necessitate or that actually enhance resilience. Because the more coherent you see, social coherence, communal coherence you see in a society, the more stronger that society is to withstand risk and extreme conditions. Two, we have also noticed that we have to be very sure that modern life, as against indigenous life, where we lived without stress, high blood pressure, different kinds of suicide, human hate, were not existing in indigenous communities, or have not been existing, still are not existing in so many indigenous communities. You see a lot of integration. You see people living without this so-called stress of modern society. What do they do? It is about the food they eat. It is the kind of communal life practices that they practice. It is about the beliefs that we live on, or we depend on, or that we believe in. It is also about the kind of folkways, rules, and traditions that our ancestors have left over to us, that we are strictly abiding by them, in spite of the fact that they don't have any written constitution anywhere. They don't have any written mandate existing anywhere on any stone or casted on any metal anywhere. But they actually tacitly exist within our minds, within our daily goings and coming, that have been so strongly supportive in enhancing our social coherence, our mental health system, our development, our resilience to extreme risk. And now I want to conclude by saying science has actually failed in recognizing that there is indigenous science. People don't want to accept, but we are calling on this to be accepted. What we practice is science. The tools that we produce, the process with which these tools are produced, our artisans use indigenous science in producing the mortars and the pestle that we use in pounding our fufu and our meals, which are the African staples. Mostly, that's what indigenous communities depend on. This is science that is involved in that. The way we preserve them, it is science. The way we harvest water from rains and from springs and from streams around us, it constitutes science. This science is very essential. The way we groom animals constitutes science. The way we observe the weather, predict, and actually build resilience to hazards constitutes science. The way we project and observe how the weather is performing constitutes science. This science is in existence, it is visible, it is tangible, and it is workable. And I want to recommend that we actually understand strongly and hold it very strongly that it should be part and parcel or at a convergence with modern science in building the kind of climate adaptation and DRR that we need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tabilloda, for these really meaningful words and for giving us the floor to continue with the discussion. So after having listened all our panelists and important experiences and cases for the application of indigenous knowledge in aspects of disaster risk reduction and management, I would like to start this interactive dialogue to discuss more, to learn and answer some of the questions that may have been generated by the participants in the chat. And also, I would like to ask to the panelists if they want to make some further comments regarding their presentations. So I don't know if someone wants to add something here. So maybe I can start by following the comments by Dr. Joda, which for me was very interesting the way you presented your comments. So, for example, it is well known that indigenous peoples and indigenous communities were the first navigators, the first engineers in the world. They predicted many important equinox. They had their own calendars. They were very good at forecasting and predicting the weather. So how do you see? This is my question for you. How do you see the main challenges around how to recover all the knowledge that has been lost due to well-known historical processes, how to recover this knowledge and how to restore it within indigenous communities so this knowledge can be passed to future generations, not only indigenous future generations, but the wider humanity, which we know that we all are facing challenging times. Today, we have COVID, we have climate change, and all these environmental issues that we all are facing. So, what is your recommendation or advice for the participants today?
Okay. Thank you very much, Yolanda, for coming to that. And I'm very glad that you actually cite the historical relevance and connect with how indigenous knowledge has played a key role in navigation science and, of course, even in printing, printing science, education science, which has been neglected. And now I will start by saying there is also a challenge of the way we approach policies. The first point now is to resolve that challenge. Like my good friend and colleague said earlier, Kai talked about policy. I think we need to enhance policies very strongly with indigenous knowledge heavily embedded, or it's important heavily embedded in policy frameworks. But before going to that point, it starts with you and I. This conversation is a very strong bedrock for galvanizing such a process. And I want to thank UNESCO for that, initiative for partnering with us and the African Union and UNDRR to have this session. So from here, we need to document indigenous knowledge. And to document it, we need to carry out more research, have more dialogues, and have more conversations in terms of bringing on board or in the space the workable indigenous knowledge systems that are relevant in Mexico, in Tanzania, in Nigeria, in Djibouti, wherever they are. We bring this isolated, piece of indigenous knowledge together and document them. After we document them, we have to validate them into policy frameworks. Not just policy frameworks, we have to validate them into the education system. We don't necessarily need to create a curricula. As people often say, I don't really buy such an idea, but it's about giving a space, like Joseph said. What space are you giving to indigenous knowledge alongside that side by side modern science? It's just like a student going into school in the morning, and then you have biology after biology, you have geography after geography, you have history, or you have, these systems. We should have indigenous knowledge put on that menu of knowledge as an essential knowledge system. But also, let us look at where does this knowledge exist? How does it support DRR and climate adaptation? We actually highlight such places and work with UNESCO in conserving more and more of these places, not only big places like the Taj Mahal, like the Victoria Falls, that should be UNESCO heritage places. We should look at even my grandmother's house that has stayed 200 years in my village should be a UNESCO preserve that can actually send knowledge over to children in my community and children all over the world once that knowledge has been documented and validated. And of course, after all this validation, we have to publish it so that it becomes global. That answers the question you said, that it should not only be a reserve for indigenous people, but a global knowledge system that provides solutions that delivers on the various local, regional, national, and international frameworks for sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, like the Sendai framework, the Paris Agreement, and the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yoda. I have a question for Joseph in the chat. So I don't know, Joseph, if you would like to answer. The question is, are there any African countries that have applied indigenous knowledge and practices for disaster risk reduction and climate change in policy formulation? And if so, could you please kindly share with us policies if possible?
Thank you so much, Yoranda, and thank you so much to the participant for this interesting question. I'm not so sure whether I'll be able to, to fully answer this question. Myself, actually, I don't call myself a regional expert, so I'm not quite familiar with some of the policies, DRR or climate policies that have actually included disaster, indigenous and local knowledge issues. However, allow me to answer this question in a more umbrella term. When you talk about indigenous and local knowledge, this form of knowledge cut across so many issues. So indigenous and local knowledge is connected not only to disaster issues, not only to climate issues, it's also connected to biodiversity issues, it's connected to the issue about sustainable blue economy. For example, you're hearing about the knowledge of the navigation. So what most countries and also with the international, platform have tried to do is to establish first a platform to preserve this knowledge. And here, for example, I can give, an example from my country. In 2016 in Kenya, for example, they develop a registration on protection of traditional knowledge and cultural expression, which is an act that was enacted by the parliament. And since then, we have seen a slow increase in understanding or appreciation of indigenous and local knowledge, but still we have a long way to go. If, for example, my colleague was talking about, if you want to have meaningful and sustainable preservation of indigenous knowledge so that it can benefit us and also the future generation, we have to think about of preserving what we have, restoring that what already has been lost, and also try to see how this can be mainstream into the education system. However, at the global level, there's some, if you like, as a bit of established instruments that are now promoting indigenous and local knowledge. And as I know in the initial presentation, I said it very clearly, but I think one of the big, the pace setter has been the IP-based, which is the intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So it's a similar body to the IPCC for those who don't know this about this body. And these do global and also regional assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. But what is very interesting, they have a support unit on indigenous and local knowledge hosted here by UNESCO. And they work with indigenous communities and indigenous and local communities alongside also with their network and intermediaries to mobilize indigenous knowledge. And this mobilized indigenous knowledge is again validated within the indigenous system, and at the end is incorporated to the global assessment. And you can read more about this. And also in context, for example, about climate change, when you look, for example, UNFCCC, they have also established a platform on local communities and indigenous people platform to also bring the issue about climate-related issues affecting indigenous people and local communities alongside their knowledge into the debate about climate change. And also earlier gave different call by different platform, including Paris Agreement, the Sendai framework. So if this framework have to be meaningful in the near future, we are likely to see increased uptake of indigenous local knowledge, particularly in the policy formulation. But I'm happy, for example, other participants, they have like very critical example where indigenous and local knowledge has been captured in DRR or climate change related policy. They can please share that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Yes, this is very interesting. So I hope we can continue with the questions. So I have a question for Mr. Tipap. I don't know if you can turn on your video. So listening your example in your country, so do you have any further example about how the indigenous and local knowledge have been successfully applied to mitigate or reduce the impact of disaster? So you talk about the forecast of weather and some of the indicators at local level, but maybe you can talk more about any other example in terms of impact of disasters.
Thank you very much for the question. And yeah, if you try to see the indigenous knowledge, automatically it's the sense that, and I can concur with it, that in observation of different issues, we can see still the IK running it and directly based on it. One of the examples that I can give out based on the first question, we have one of the river in one of the districts in our working area known as Simanjiro. It's one of the river that was first faced a disaster problem where man-made activity really made the river die out. But through the IK and community of the indigenous living around that, the river will revive, and now it's running and it's okay. But what they did is highly making sure that all the traditional trees and even the outside traditional trees could be maintained and be pruned in a traditional way to make the river revive to its life. So this is one of the examples of the IK, despite the local authorities and bylaws that came in, it didn't help until the IK of the indigenous community living there was put into practice. Based on the second question, that it also wanted the light of the change and multidimensional risk based on the climate change. The question said that, is indigenous knowledge still relevant in light of climate change and multidimensional risk? Yeah, because we have our way of livelihood that really enable the communities of indigenous bind to it. For example, I just cited an example of the traditional land use plan, where this traditional land use plan is demarcated in a way that it goes to the 2 seasons that I mentioned previously, that this time this area is being applied for a certain activity of livelihood, where they will do the, it will be used for livestock, and this area will be left to the other season of the dry season. Despite the situation that currently we are facing of the long drought and even long rain season, still the community divert into it. But also we have our own traditional way of the ecosystem. That is also another way that enable the community of indigenous people use their IK still in the situation of climate change, have it. But this brings another problem. The previous speaker just mentioned about the policies. This brings another problem in the overlapping of policies, especially in areas like Tanzania. The natural resource policies and the land policy overlap because of the conservation that has kept going on in these communities or pastoralists. So they become the victims of conservation, while that is their livelihood that they have. So based on the question that I've got it, still we have that due to the IK, it is more generational to generation.
So I have another question. Any of you of the panelists can answer to that. My question is, how can we harmonize the differences and uniqueness of our indigenous and local knowledge in different parts of the world and the continent in question to be used as another valid source of knowledge? Not, for example, I remember the words said by Mr. Yoda that indigenous knowledge is a proper science, which it is, because it has its own methods and ways of validation, its own tools and approaches to the understanding of the natural world. So how we can harmonize not only Western scientific knowledge, but also other types of knowledge along with indigenous science? Any of you wants to take the floor?
Thank you very much for allowing me. I think I can't see his name, Dola or Duda. The dog categorically explained that when he was putting emphasis on the significance of knowledge integration. And also Jose was talking about multiple evidence approach. Well, so this was basically for the science and the indigenous. But when we come to harmonizing indigenous knowledge systems, my take on that is that, it will depend on what is at hand. What is the priority? What factor do we need to address? Then we'll be able to look around indigenous knowledge systems in terms of what we are trying to address and see what and how other indigenous communities around the world, someone in Tanzania, someone in Sweden, someone in Canada, someone in South Africa, were able to address to that element. However, on a general note, indigenous knowledge systems were influenced by the environment in which they lived, because they brought in, living in the environment, you become part of the system. And the system itself will give you a window to interpret on how you have to maintain it for sustainability and ensure that there is health in human life, and as well as there is biosafety in the environment in which you live. So one way or the other, that's why when you go about, you find that indigenous knowledge systems or factors on how they address the certain issues are more or less the same, because it is a holistic understanding per given environment. with human element playing a central figure in that given environment to harmoniously maintain it for future use. So that way, I would say harmonization could be good, but it will depend on what element or factor do you want to put together. Then we look around, we review, we analyze, we explore, we analyze into interpretable terms the relationship between various knowledge systems among the indigenous communities. And that way we could be able to strike the balance on taking it way forward. I like it when the doc was saying this knowledge need to be presented, processed, presented, and publicized for not only indigenous people, but for global consumption. Then it becomes, this knowledge as well will become subject of that model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Satao, for joining us. Maybe I will come back to you after just asking another question from the panel.
Can I add to what he just said, please? Before, just to add to what my fellow friend has
please.
said, very relevantly, it's straightforward. Is I think we have now different organizations, NGOs, networks that are working on this subject. And good enough, we now have an African Alliance on Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices that can work strongly, closely with the UN system like UNESCO and the African Union to actually brace what my fellow brother just said earlier in terms of harmonizing, because harmonizing has a lot to do with policy support and validation. So that's one way we can harmonize. So at the continental level, then at the global level now, we merge our own African knowledge with what is coming from Latin America, from Asia, from America itself, and generally globally. And then we can actually have a harmonious template, or not if not necessarily a template, should I say, an encyclopedia, of indigenous knowledge systems, practices, and science that offers that broad ocean of knowledge for anyone who wants to consult, who wants to talk about it, who wants to build on it, and who wants to keep it for future. That's one. Then two, we need to collaborate strongly with the African Union at the level of Africa, just like maybe the continental commissions, let me just put it that way, to actually bring forward the documented, the validated, indigenous knowledge systems, to quote it together or to actually integrate it together with other regional blocks on systems, and then we can have a strongly validated global indigenous knowledge system that everyone looks at it. So, and then also we should not forget that modern science should not be thrown in or cast into the oceans. There is very strong relevance for the use of modern science in enhancing indigenous knowledge as well. We now have apps that can quickly synaptically communicate certain aspects, which we don't, perhaps we should take hundreds of years to develop such. This is where a confluence or a convergence of indigenous knowledge and modern science comes together. So we use the science of communication to brace with our own indigenous communication. That will help in harmonizing, because communication of whatever knowledge systems isolated somewhere to what is isolated somewhere can quickly reach each other through such a medium. That's just to add to what my fellow brother just said. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see that my colleague Joseph has raised his hand. So Joseph, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of my other panelists. I don't want to be a bit pessimistic, but I think when you talk about harmonization, we should talk about harmonization carefully, because as we know, indigenous and local knowledge is a very contextualized knowledge. And if the focus is on harmonization, particularly at the global level, we may end up losing or ignoring crucial contextualized knowledge. I would rather recommend that we focused on the issues of focus. For example, in this context, for example, we look at the based on different climatic and geographic location. How can we borrow from different knowledge system rather than trying to harmonize knowledge system? And already from my reading, if you look, for example, some of the examples of some of the methods used by the indigenous and local communities, for example, trying to observe the movement of safari ants. This method has been practiced different communities across Kenya, different communities in Tanzania, which is in East Africa. But when you cross all over to West Africa, for example, in Senegal, they're using the same method. So if we try in terms of contextualizing and then try to harmonize based on a specific issue, that would be much better rather than talking about the umbrella of harmonization of indigenous and local knowledge, which might, for example, be very different. For example, if you look at Mount Mulanje in Malawi, they have very contextualized knowledge that they use in disaster risk reduction. And maybe this knowledge might not be applicable into or cannot be harmonized with other knowledge systems. So it doesn't necessarily mean it cannot work, but try to see in other contexts, for example, other mountainous ecosystem, maybe in other countries like Pakistan, how can they borrow from each other and enhance each other language? That would be my take on that.
Yeah, I think the question about harmonizing is not bridging. I agree with you that each knowledge system should work apart alone. And my concern was more about, so for example, many of the current approaches for environmental monitoring, etc., are using methodologies that are not from indigenous, or that does not come from indigenous approaches or indigenous methods. And my question was more about how the use of other tools and techniques and approaches from other knowledge systems, when applied to indigenous knowledge system, might have an influence into indigenous understanding of the natural world. So maybe I don't know if any of our participants can answer and develop further on that. And if not, I have some questions from the participants that are available in the chat, but I can just start by reading some of them. So, for example, one of the participants in this session today asked about how to enhance indigenous knowledge impact on policy formulation. So anyone wants to?
Let me just jump in on that, because in the interest of time, it should be very clear how this can have impact on the policy formulation is about the examples that we share. Is this science tangible? Does it have measurable impact on community life somewhere? If the answer is yes, then we have to document that science, validate it, and then influence it to become part of a policy system where government policy frameworks or regional policy frameworks should consider that this practice actually constitutes a system for disaster risk reduction, for climate adaptation that needs to be kept into the policy system so as to guide life against mortality, against risk, against vulnerabilities, of course, enhancing people's capacity to adapt and live a happy and a resilient life. That should be the point, or how indigenous systems should influence or should deliver impact on policy framework. If it is not solution oriented, it cannot have any influence. Yes, there are isolated cases of indigenous knowledge systems that have become very weak, that perhaps do not constitute any very strong, preservation raison d'etre. but there are others in terms of the use of tools, the use of knowledge systems, the communication morals, ethics, folkways, and behavioral conditions in society are very key. They are still playing a very key role. In Africa, you see young people still being very, very polite and respectful to elders. There's no rule book anywhere that says be polite, be humble, and be respectful to elders. But it is simple knowledge that has been passed over to mother and from mother to child, and it is going. How does this play a key role in terms of limiting crime, limiting social vulnerabilities, limiting incoherence in terms of conflict management or conflict, volatility of political systems, in the way we have politicians with bad behavior, with arrogance, that are constituting threat to societies? This should be very key in looking at these indigenous practices as short, mid, and long-term solutions that can enhance policy. I think that's how indigenous knowledge systems can be part of, the system that impact policy. If I'm right, if I answer your question well, thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. I have Joseph and Naileji. I have some questions and comments from them. So after that, we will continue with the closing of the session. So any comments you might or you would like to add?
Thank you, Randa. I'll be very super quick, and I agree with Toby on those points. Maybe just to add, particularly on the policy formulation, because if you look at different countries' processes when they are developing or reviewing a policy, more or less they establish a task force or a working group that is going to lead that policy formulation. So the first stage, when establishing this task force, is to make sure that we have a good representation of social scientists and also include indigenous and local, representative of indigenous and local knowledge holders into the same task force who have good network and who are fully acknowledged by indigenous and local communities in the same. So through this, they are likely to influence the policy formulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Naileji, would you?
Yeah, I would just like to say thank you to Joseph because what he has said, I heard that. But I wanted just to put out that despite that, we like if the government, even the politician, will take time to learn the livelihood of these communities, especially to understand how they live, how do we incorporate this and their knowledge into the system, into the policy formulation, and trying not to put the overlapping of policies, because most of the time, mainly the community of indigenous are facing this situation of policy overlap because of the lack of them being part of the formulation, and even the government official or other people who are working on policy understanding the real situation and the real livelihood of the communities of indigenous.
Thank you, Naileji. This is we still have some questions from the participants. So I don't know. So maybe I can read some of them, and then in case some of the panelists would like to answer like very quickly, we have like 1 or 2 minutes for that, and then we will continue with the closing of the session. So for example, I have a question about how traditional knowledge around how about the stars determine the seasons are no longer in place and unpredictable. So how is the indigenous knowledge still relevant to climate change? If any one of you wants to give a very short answer, is very welcome.
It's a difficult question to answer in 1 minute, but my response would be, we are saying that indigenous and local knowledge has been tested, through years, and it also evolves with time. So indigenous knowledge is not static, and of course, we understand like some of the indigenous and local knowledge has been lost, and maybe one of the start point would be to try to preserve the indigenous knowledge that has been lost, but not only the language, but also the associated institution as well. So we need to empower these indigenous and local communities in this context. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps because of time, I might not be answering very straight on that. We understand there is a strong influence of indigenous science on astrology. It's written, of course, it is even in modern science, but it is not actually acknowledged to be, taken from indigenous practices. But this is actually happening. The hieroglyphics in the early century, they are in existence. The papyrus, which all came from Africa, they are existing, but they are not acknowledged to be sourced from Africa. I also want to talk about the injustices, that is happening within the global policy system. That is, we need to bridge that gap. If that gap is not bridged, we can actually find a comfortable space for indigenous knowledge, because these gaps have existed for too long. So we need to have this strong influence in pushing for justice on knowledge system, knowledge management. Like I said earlier, why is it that if your article is not peer reviewed by a Western, institution, it is not considered an article for publication? And of course, so these are the areas where we see, the spotted nature of the existence of injustices that are not favorable for the promotion or the advancement of indigenous knowledge systems, because this very science and this very policy powers actually also influence the way our policy frameworks are actually positioned. So I am recommending strongly to UNESCO as a custodian of the global cultural system, to look into this social aspect and this justice aspect, and also the cultural aspect of balancing the injustices. Two, I want to say, we have seen very well that even the fashion industry is pushing very strongly, against indigenous practices that help humans stay healthy, strong, and more resilient. Look at the number of artificial hairs from plastics that are littering our oceans and our sea. We shouldn't see that fashion as a favorable fashion. So if that fashion means a destruction of our ocean system, our landfills, and our agricultural systems, we should address it as an unfavorable, and unfriendly, and unethical practice. That is it. If mining will bring naturally occurring radioactive materials that hurt humans, then it is the same way as that plastic creates naturally occurring radioactive materials in the sea that hurts aquatic life. And the destruction of this aquatic life is a creation of a vacuum that comes with vulnerabilities on which so many disasters lies. This should also be looked deeply into, so that we have a balance from this point. Then we should also look at how are we classifying in terms of the classification. In Africa, you call an African language a dialect, but the European languages are called the languages. So we have to look also at these points where we should not destroy the self-esteem of a certain culture. We hamper the esteem of our people from bringing out, unleashing the strength of their indigenous science, which it is tied to their language, it is tied to their cultural behavior. Somebody dressing should not be a laughing stock to someone else, because if that dressing does not destroy the environment, if it does not hurt humans, if it does not constitute a vulnerability for risk and for climate vulnerabilities, then it is a healthy practice that we need to push, promote, and of course, enhance it. And I want to end by saying, UNESCO, let's not only look at big cultural sites as sites for heritage or heritage sites. A tree that is somewhere that has lasted 100 years, and how it was preserved, how it was sustained, should be a UNESCO heritage site, because it constitutes a bulk of knowledge for generations to come, to understand that this is a very essential knowledge for ecosystems and biodiversity conservation. Human beings who have actually created little, no matter how little, certain practices just to end here, certain practices in communities that are holding our planet together in building resilience and adaptation for people should be promoted and enhanced. Finally, enhance the capacity of the alliance to build capacity for NGOs and bring NGOs across Africa together with the African Union and the UN. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and apologies in advance for this short time for discussion. So now we are running a little bit late, but I would like to appreciate again all the panelists and the presentations and their valuable interventions. So to close this event, I would like to invite again our friend and colleague Gatpoto Kai. So Mr. Kai, would you please give us very briefly some closing remarks of the session, please?
No, this has been really a very productive session, and I would like to thank our panelists for very enriching experience. Just some takeaway home, really, in this session. From what I heard, indigenous people, given their dependency on natural resources, are very vulnerable to climate risk. But again, there is, from the other version of it, is that they are actually resilient. Most of the time we look at them as vulnerable, but they are actually resilient. And one example is COVID-19. But they also are resilient because they also have knowledge systems that have been tested and that have been evolving over time from generation to generation. But I also heard very clearly from Dr. Karanja, and I like this perspective very much, that we have to be very careful in implying that indigenous knowledge has to be integrated into science, because two of them are heterogeneous. They are very different body of knowledge, and they may not easily reconcile. So I think this is really very important perspective that came out from this session. And again, the issue of harmonization came up, but again, we were warned by Dr. Kranja again that issues to do with indigenous knowledge are deeply contextual, and harmonization may not be really that uniform, but we may learn lessons from one place to another. But in general, really, we are all in the same page that indigenous knowledge is relevant in contemporary society. And we have also seen from a TPAP example that even indigenous knowledge systems are not affected by climate change. Actually, they are adapting to climate change, the indigenous community. And these are lessons that need to be documented and used for adaptation. So in my view, when we talk of policy formulation and including indigenous knowledge system in policy dialogue, we have to make sure that we have those knowledge system documented. And I think this was very clear from Tabi. We need to ensure they are documented, they are validated, and then we can now use them as tools that can influence policy discourses. The truth is that we tend to, even education system, favoring the Western scientific worldview over what the indigenous people know. So I think it's important to make a business case that indigenous knowledge is relevant and it is cheaper, it's available. It will not cost you billions of dollars to undertake a very sophisticated scientific research. These are, practical things. And I think it's important that we need to make a business case to ensure that this informs policy dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kai, for this word. And I think we should leave it like this, just to give respect to the time to the other participants and panelists and all the people in this room. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I wish you the best in this beautiful work. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day.